This is Ross Feingold on the Taiwan Hashtag program, coming to you from Taipei, Taiwan on Storm Media. Oh my, Tsai-Lai, possibly a DPP high. What are we talking about today? It is President Tsai's selection of her vice presidential running mate for the upcoming presidential election. Also on the same day will be the legislative event, Taiwan's parliament election, January 11th, 2020. Last week we talked about the Kuomintang candidate, Kuo-yu, mayor of Kaohsiung. He picked Simon Zhang, a well-known technology industry executive, previously served as the Minister of Science and Technology, as well as premier for a brief period in 2016 as the Kuomintang vice presidential candidate. A few days later, President Tsai, no surprise, she selected William Lai Ching-te. Who is William Lai Ching-te? Well, he's a former mayor of Tainan, one of Taiwan's largest cities in the south, very popular with tourists, known for its cultural heritage, and of course, like many places in Taiwan, known for its food. He's also a former legislator, but most recently, he was premier. He was the second premier to serve under President Tsai. President Tsai took office in May 2016. Her first premier, Ing-wen, lasted a little more than a year, and that was followed by William Lai, who also lasted only a little more than a year. Why did he only last a little more than a year in the job? Well, the public was very unhappy with his job performance and the performance of his team. Yes, a lot of policy execution issues, very disappointing to the public. And that resulted in the 2018 local election, November 2018 local election, big losses for the DPP. And after that, William Lai Ching-te stepped down as premier to take some of the political responsibility, but proving once again that politicians have 9 lives, and it's something that the DPP government is very good at doing. He has now been invited back to a possibly even more senior position to be the vice presidential running mate. Why else is this odd other than his poor performance in the eyes of the public as premier in late 2017 and throughout 2018? Well, that's because he challenged President Tsai in the DPP primary earlier this year. Yes, her former premier, in an act that some saw as extraordinarily disloyal, he decided to challenge an incumbent president from his own party, someone who had given him the job of premier in the DPP primary. And then he lost, and there were accusations that the primary process was stacked against William Lai or his supporters. And then this has to do with the formula that was used to telephone people in the phone poll that was conducted. But be that as it may, Mr. Lai lost. He went silent for a few months. He did a little bit of overseas travel, as you do when you're a former politician out of a job. And then towards the end of the summer, speculation began that they would get back together again and that he would rejoin the DPP team as the vice presidential running mate. So this speculation has been in the news for about 6 weeks, ever since end of the summer, after it was clear who the Kuomintang candidate was, and it was clear that Mayor Kuo of Taipei was not going to run as an independent candidate. Terry Go was not going to run as an independent candidate. And another important factor was President Tsai's poll numbers kept increasing. As we've talked about on previous shows when we've looked at polls, Kuo-yu, the Kuomintang nominee, he has been falling precipitously in the polls. President Tsai in many polls has a 10 to 15 point lead. It's looking really good for President Tsai's re-election. So she had the confidence to bring back William Lai Ching-te, to her team as her running mate. So what is William Lai's most important role as Tsai Ing-wen's running mate, as the vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Progressive Party? Well, to be frank, his most important role is not to be outside of government, possibly criticizing the president. So she is co-opting him on the assumption that President Tsai is going to be reelected. I suppose if you're President Tsai, you'd rather have William Lai inside on your team than outside. You wouldn't want him working as a scholar, being on TV, traveling around the world, making speeches, for example, where he might be critical of government policy and might say things like, well, if I was the president or if I was the premier, here's how I would do things. So you eliminate him as a political risk, as a source of criticism. So of course that's a very brilliant move by President Tsai, and again, no surprise that she's going to do this. So she co-opts William Lai, brings him back on the team, eliminates the possibility that over the next 4 years of her second term, and keeping in mind she is term limited, if she wins, she cannot run for a third consecutive term, then Mr. Lai is now part of the team. He won't be on the outside criticizing her. What else is Mr. Lai's role going to be if they win the election, which is looking increasingly likely? Well, he is there to unify the part of the supporters of the DPP who were unhappy with President Tsai. Believe it or not, there are many voters who usually vote for the DPP who are quite unhappy with President Tsai, notwithstanding her increasing poll numbers over the last few months. But again, this goes back to the policy execution of the DPP in the first 2 to 3 years of President Tsai's term in office. It resulted in a disaster in the local elections last November. There are a lot of voters who feel that President Tsai was not aggressive enough on anti-China initiatives, on initiatives to establish a separate Taiwan identity to show not just the public here in Taiwan, but the world, the global community, that Taiwan is separate from China. And William Lai, he's very famous, in fact, for saying in the legislative yuan, in the parliament, under questioning by opposition lawmakers, that he is a worker for Taiwan independence. He said it in Mandarin. Of course, it sounded better in Mandarin. But he said, I'm a worker, I'm a supporter, basically, of Taiwan independence. And that's why there was a call by this segment of DPP supporters for William Lai to challenge Tsai Ing-wen in the party primary in 2019. So there was a perception that Tsai Ing-wen was too cautious when it comes to China issues. She kind of wanted to not rock the boat, not anger the United States. But on the other hand, we see the United States, the Trump administration, as well as Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress, very supportive of Tsai Ing-wen, very supportive of Taiwan. So President Tsai, maybe she's growing into being a little more outspoken on these issues. We've seen that over the course of the last 6 months with the very vocal support she has given for protesters in Hong Kong. She doesn't condemn the violence as much as she condemns the government, and that's very common for outside observers outside of Hong Kong. And she's been very vocal and gotten a lot of international media attention for that. Probably helps with her support in the United States, and obviously it's helped with the support here in Taiwan. So if she was more conservative, I just prefer the status quo, I don't want to push these issues over 2016, 17, or 18, that seems to have changed. And she could work a little more closely with William Lai. So William Lai, he's going to be talking to voters in the next few weeks as we get closer to Election Day and saying, look, you got me on the team now. If you were concerned that President Tsai wasn't aggressive enough on these Taiwan identity issues, I'm part of the team. I'm your guy. You don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to suspect President Tsai is not a supporter of Taiwan's identity. So again, a very brilliant move by President Tsai to co-opt Lai back on the team on this issue. There are some other policy issues that Lai might be able to help with as well. One of the most notable ones is the marriage equality debate, where there were a lot of more conservative voters in central, southern, rural parts of Taiwan who were a little upset with the party's support for marriage equality, including the president. William Lai, coming from the south, or at least having served as mayor of Tainan, very close to the grassroots in these parts of Taiwan. Again, he could communicate with these voters and say, look, I'm your guy. If you think President Tsai is some liberal or someone up in the big city, she's been in the capital too long, she's not in touch with central or southern Taiwan, you got me as part of the team. So again, a very strategic move to bring someone in who could talk to the grassroots, and William Lai is certainly that person. One more thing that Mr. Lai might do, well, whatever tasks President Tsai assigns to him. If we look at the example of the incumbent vice president, Chen Jianren, a medical doctor by background, and he was assigned to look at pension reform. And that was a very controversial issue. President Tsai had campaigned on doing something about this because there was a large pension liability that the government could not cover going out into the future. So a lot of pensions were actually reduced. The DPP used its legislative majority, large majority in the legislative yuan, to pass reforms. There are some voters who are going to be unhappy about this because some of these teachers, retired military officers, enlistees, people who served their career in the military, they did have their pension cut along with some civil servants, so they're not happy. Whether or not it's enough to change the presidential election result looks increasingly unlikely, but that is an ideal task to give to a vice presidential candidate, and Lai will probably fulfill that role as well. In Taiwan's government system, there's, like a lot of countries, there's not a very formal responsibility for what the vice president does, so it'll basically be whatever President Tsai assigns to him. Now, there is a risk there because William Lai did serve as premier, and whoever is going to serve as premier next year, if Tsai-Lai win the election, will have to manage those relationships. He or she, whoever the premier is, will have to manage the relationship with the president as well as with a vice president who previously served as premier. So that'll be a dynamic that will need to be managed, and it might be very difficult. We'll see how it goes. So the best way to avoid that, again, will probably be for President Tsai to find some projects for Mr. Lai or Vice President Lai, if they do win, to be responsible for, and some public policy issue that requires committees and internal reporting and planning, and then the announcement of some proposed legislation that then goes to the legislative yuan, Taiwan's parliament. That would seem to be the perfect model to emulate for Vice President Lai. Another thing to watch, though, is 2024. I know we haven't even had the 2020 election yet, and we're talking about 2024, but what this ultimately is all about, and why Mr. Lai is the vice presidential candidate and why he accepted the offer, is to set him up to run for president in 2024. Will there be a DPP primary in 2023 in the months preceding the 2024 election, just like we had this year? Well, we can't forecast that far ahead. We don't have that capability. Very likely there will be a primary. There will be other politicians who think that they are just as qualified to be the party's nominee as Mr. Lai. But serving as vice president for the next 3+ years will certainly set Mr. Lai up to be the obvious choice. Now, arguably, Mr. Lai, you could have done that or had that opportunity by not being inside government, because then you could have said, hey, none of this is my responsibility. I wasn't part of the team. So if anything goes wrong in the next 3+ years, Mr. Lai, if you weren't part of the governing team, you could have said, it's got nothing to do with me. I have some different ideas. But now that he's part of the team, he's going to have to take political responsibility for things that go well as things that go wrong. That might hurt him in 2023 if he seeks the presidential nomination, which, of course, is very likely, all but guaranteed, and we'll revisit that in a few years from now. But for now, it's Tsai-Lai. It might give a DPP high. They can't get too much higher in the polls because they already have a large lead over Kuo-yu of the Kuomintang. But we'll see if there is any poll bump for Tsai-Lai in the coming weeks as we get closer to the election. I'm Ross Feingold, and you've been watching Taiwan Hashtag on Storm Media.